On the morning she lost her family, the sky above Seattle was impossibly blue, like the kind of day meant for barbecues and second chances. Her husband kissed her forehead before court, her daughter left fingerprints on the kitchen window, and everything looked painfully ordinary. By sunset, there was a photograph on her phone she couldn't unsee, and a silence in her house that would echo for 5 years. Some stories begin with betrayal. Others begin with the moment you realize you were the last to know. If stories about love, guilt, and the price of ambition linger with you, stay a little longer. There are doors in this house we haven't opened yet. On the morning everything ended, Madeline Carter stood barefoot in her kitchen, watching sunlight pool across the hardwood floors like honey. Bellevue was quiet at 7:30 a.m. The lawns were clipped into submission. Recycling bins lined the curb in obedient rows. Inside the Carter house, coffee brewed in a stainless steel machine Jonathan had insisted on buying after a conference in Milan. The house smelled of espresso and Lily's strawberry shampoo. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary. Unthreatening. Jonathan stood at the island counter, already in navy scrubs, scrolling through emails on his phone. His posture was slightly turned away from her, a habit she had noticed but never named. Lily sat at the table swinging her legs, coloring a horse purple because, as she'd explained, real colors are boring. Madeline remembered thinking how peaceful it looked. The three of them contained in that warm rectangle of morning light. Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it quickly. Too quickly. Madeline didn't ask who it was. She rarely did. In marriages like theirs, educated, successful, admired, privacy was framed as respect. They were not the suspicious kind. They were the competent kind. Still, something in the air shifted. Not enough to alarm, just enough to register. Late surgery tonight, she asked, rinsing her mug. Possibly, he replied. His voice was even, controlled. Claire's foundation board is visiting the trauma wing this afternoon. Administration wants us visible. Claire. The name landed softly. Madeline knew her in the distant, polished way Seattle professionals knew each other. Claire Donovan. Elegant. Strategic. Married to a real estate magnate who funded hospital expansions. She chaired galas where Madeline sometimes donated silent auction items. Busy day, Madeline said. Always is. He kissed Lily's hair, then brushed his lips against Madeline's temple. A familiar gesture. Efficient. Practiced. By noon, Madeline was in her corner office downtown, drafting a motion in a shareholder dispute case. The Seattle skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling glass. She liked the view. It made everything feel conquerable. Her phone buzzed. A notification, not a call. Jonathan's iCloud account, still synced to the family iPad Lily used for games at home, had mirrored a message preview. She almost ignored it. But the words were already there, floating at the top of her screen. Claire D. Last night shouldn't have happened, but I don't regret it. Madeline's hand went still on her keyboard. She stared at the message until the screen dimmed. There are moments when the body knows before the mind catches up. A tightening in the ribs. A faint buzzing in the ears. The sudden awareness of how quiet a room can be. She told herself it could mean anything. A donor dinner. A private conversation. Emotional oversharing. But she knew the language of litigation. She knew implication when she saw it. She opened the shared photo stream instead. Scrolled. Nothing unusual. Lily's art projects. Jonathan's surgical team photos. A recent charity gala. Then she checked the messages. There were more. Weeks of them. Professional at first. Then personal. Then threaded with intimacy that never used explicit words, but didn't need to. I keep thinking about your hands. Does she suspect? We have to be careful. Madeline's reflection in the glass looked composed. Almost regal. Inside, something cracked, quietly, like fine porcelain under invisible pressure. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she scheduled an early departure from work and drove home through the floating bridge traffic. The lake stretched out in indifferent blue beside her. She would confront him that evening. Calmly. Methodically. She would gather facts. That was what she did for a living. When she pulled into the driveway, Lily was already home. Jonathan had picked her up from school, as he did most Tuesdays. The house felt normal. Too normal. Jonathan stood in the kitchen again, slicing apples for Lily. He looked up and smiled. It was the same smile from that morning. "You're early," he said. "I finished ahead of schedule." He nodded. "I have to head back to the hospital in an hour. Emergency consult." Madeline watched his hands. Steady. Skilled. The hands Claire had mentioned. "Jonathan," she began. But Lily interrupted, holding up her purple horse. "Mom, can we go to the park later?" "Of course," Madeline said automatically. Jonathan's phone buzzed again on the counter. They both looked at it. He reached for it faster than necessary. "It's work," he said. Madeline held his gaze a second too long. He didn't look away, but something shuddered behind his eyes. That was the moment she understood. Not the messages, not the words, the concealment, the deliberate management of information. By 5:30, Jonathan had left with Lily in the back seat of his Tesla, promising ice cream on the way home from the park. Madeline stayed behind, telling herself she needed time to think before the confrontation. She stood at the kitchen sink again, just as she had that morning. The sunlight was fading now, turning the sky into a softer shade of gold. Her phone rang. An unknown number. "Mrs. Carter," a male voice asked. "Professional. Controlled." "Yes. There's been an accident." The world did not shatter immediately. It narrowed. She remembered the sound of water still running from the faucet. The way her reflection in the window looked unchanged. The absurd clarity of the word accident. At the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nurses moved in choreographed urgency. Someone guided her into a small room with neutral walls. Jonathan was there. His scrubs were stained, not dramatically, but enough. His face was ashen. "I looked down for 1 second, he whispered. "My phone," he stopped. Madeline didn't ask whose message it had been. A doctor entered, spoke gently, used words like impact, internal bleeding. "We did everything." The sky outside the hospital windows remained blue long after sunset. By midnight, the news had begun to circulate, first about the accident, then about the messages someone at the hospital had seen flash across Jonathan's screen in the chaos. By morning, whispers had hardened into rumor, and Madeline, sitting alone in her daughter's silent bedroom, understood that she had not only lost her child, she had lost the story of her life. 5 years later, she would have wealth, power, and a Manhattan skyline at her feet. But on that Tuesday in Bellevue, all she had was a blue sky that refused to darken, and a message she could never unread. Grief did not arrive as a scream. It arrived as paperwork. By Thursday morning, Madeline was sitting across from a hospital administrator in a beige office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. A folder lay open between them. Incident reports, witness statements, procedural summaries. Words stacked neatly where her daughter should have been. Jonathan had been advised to take temporary leave. "Just until the review is complete," the administrator said carefully. "There will be questions about distraction." Distraction. Such a polite word. Madeline's eyes drifted to Jonathan's hands folded in his lap. The same hands that had tied Lily's shoes that morning. The same hands that had reached for his phone. He had not tried to defend himself. That unsettled her more than denial would have. At home, the house had already begun to shift in tone. Flowers arrived in pale arrangements. Neighbors left casseroles on the porch, their faces folded into expressions of rehearsed sorrow. The doorbell rang often, and each time Madeline felt the faint humiliation of being observed. People looked at her differently now, not just as a grieving mother, but as a wife. On Friday afternoon, a colleague from the firm stopped by. Daniel Whitaker, senior partner, silver-haired, discreet. He stood in the entryway holding a condolence card, his voice low. "If there's anything the firm can do, take as much time as you need," he said. She thanked him. They spoke in measured tones, as if discussing a merger rather than a child's funeral. Before leaving, Daniel hesitated. "There are conversations circulating," he added carefully, "about Jonathan and a donor." Madeline felt something cold settle into her spine. "I'm aware," she said. The rumors moved faster than grief. A nurse had mentioned seeing messages pop up during the chaos in the ER. Someone else had seen Claire in a private hallway the week before. Too close, too familiar. By the time Lily's obituary appeared online, anonymous comments had begun to surface beneath it, subtle, insinuating, cruel in their curiosity. Jonathan retreated inward. He moved through the house like someone underwater, answering calls from hospital legal counsel, deleting emails, staring too long at nothing. On Sunday night, Madeline found him sitting in Lily's room. The curtains were half drawn. Her small bed was still unmade from that morning she had rushed out the door. "I ended it," Jonathan said without looking up. Madeline remained in the doorway. "When?" she asked. "The day of the accident." His voice cracked, barely audible. "She called me. I told her it was over, that I couldn't do this anymore." I was reaching to silence the phone when he pressed his palms to his eyes. Madeline felt the information enter her like a second collision. "You chose that moment," she said quietly. "I didn't plan. You chose her before you chose us." The room seemed to shrink around them. He stood then, stepping toward her, but she lifted a hand. Not violently, just enough. "Don't," she whispered. He stopped. There were 1,000 things she could have said. Accusations sharpened by loss. Words designed to wound. Instead, what came out was softer. "Did you love her?" Jonathan hesitated. That pause was answer enough. "It wasn't," he began. But she turned away. In the days that followed, the story escaped the hospital and entered the local press. A brief column in a Seattle medical blog mentioned a personal distraction linked to a respected surgeon involved in a fatal crash. No names at first, then hints, then confirmation. Claire Donovan issued a public statement about inappropriate emotional boundaries and asked for privacy. Her husband did not appear beside her in photographs anymore. Madeline watched it all unfold from the corner of her living room sofa, laptop balanced on her knees. Each headline felt like a quiet theft, Lily's death becoming narrative, context, scandal. The funeral was small but tense. Claire did not attend. Jonathan stood beside Madeline at the graveside, close enough to be mistaken for solidarity. When the casket was lowered, something in Madeline finally broke, but not outwardly. There were no dramatic collapses, no screams. Just a sudden, irreversible detachment. That night, after the guests had gone and the flowers began to wilt, Madeline packed a single suitcase. Jonathan found her in their bedroom, folding a black blazer with mechanical precision. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I can't stay here. This is our home." It was. He stepped closer, desperation surfacing for the first time. "Madeline, please. We lost her. Both of us." She zipped the suitcase shut. "You lost her," she said evenly. "I lost both of you." He flinched. "I will not let her memory be reduced to a footnote in your affair," she continued. "I won't stand beside you while people whisper about which message was worth her life." His shoulders sagged. "Where will you go?" "New York," she said. "The firm's been asking me to transfer for years." The truth was, she had always resisted the move for Lily's sake. For stability. For family dinners and predictable schools. Now stability felt like a lie. Jonathan reached for her hand. This time, she did not step back, but she did not close her fingers around his either. "I never meant for any of this," he said. She believed him, and that was the worst part. Because intent did not change outcome. Regret did not resurrect children. Love, fractured by secrecy, did not reassemble under pressure. She left before dawn. As her car merged onto I-90 toward the airport, Bellevue receded in the rearview mirror. Lawns, trees, the hospital skyline in the distance. Behind her, Jonathan remained in a house filled with silence. Ahead of her, Manhattan waited with glass towers and anonymity. Madeline did not yet know that 5 years from now she would stand at the top of one of those towers, wealth and influence finally within reach. All she knew was this: grief could hollow a person out, but ambition could fill the space, if you were willing to let it. The divorce paperwork arrived by courier. Thick, cream-colored, clinical. Madeline signed her name without rereading every clause. She had already memorized the terms in her head. Division of property, joint statements, a confidentiality agreement carefully worded to protect the hospital from extended liability. The language avoided the word affair. It favored phrases like marital breakdown and irreconcilable differences. Jonathan signed the same week. In Seattle, News traveled not in explosions, but in polite conversations over catered lunches. At law firms, at hospital board meetings, at private school fundraisers where Claire Donovan no longer appeared. The medical blog updated its earlier report. This time it named Jonathan, a respected trauma surgeon involved in a fatal accident while responding to repeated personal calls from a donor-affiliated individual. Madeline read it in the quiet of her nearly empty living room. Most of the furniture had already been sold. The house felt hollowed out, like something already abandoned. Her phone buzzed constantly. Colleagues, distant acquaintances, journalists testing the edges of decency. She ignored them all. Jonathan called once, late at night. "Are you in New York yet?" he asked. "Tomorrow," she replied. There was a pause heavy enough to measure. "I never wanted to lose you," he said. Madeline looked around the room that used to contain birthday banners and framed school photos. "You didn't want to get caught," she answered. He did not argue. Outside, rain pressed against the windows in steady sheets. Seattle was reclaiming its familiar gray. The next morning, Claire issued another public apology. This one more carefully curated. She described her relationship with Jonathan as a lapse in judgment during a vulnerable time. She mentioned grief, stress, human weakness. Madeline read every word. Claire's statement framed the affair as an emotional misstep that tragically coincided with an accident. It suggested shared responsibility without naming it. What it did not mention was Lily. Madeline closed her laptop slowly. In that omission, she saw the future. Lily would become context, a tragedy that complicated adult mistakes. She would not allow that. But she also would not scream. Instead, she packed the last of her belongings into 2 suitcases and boarded a red-eye flight to Manhattan. The plane hummed steadily as it crossed the country. Around her, strangers slept with open mouths and dim reading lights. Madeline stared at the dark oval of the window. Grief had shifted shape. It was no longer a sharp blade. It was something colder, structured. In New York, Daniel Whitaker met her at the firm's Midtown office with quiet efficiency. The building rose 50 stories above Lexington Avenue, its lobby all marble and glass. "We'll keep your transfer low profile," he said. "Focus on litigation. No media exposure." She appreciated that he treated her not as fragile, but as strategic. Her new apartment was a high-rise rental overlooking the East River. Smaller than the house in Bellevue, but immaculate. Anonymous. The first night there, she stood by the window and watched traffic trace thin lines of light across the FDR Drive. No one here knew her as Jonathan's wife. No one here knew Lily. That anonymity both soothed and terrified her. Back in Seattle, Jonathan's leave from the hospital became indefinite. A formal review concluded that while no criminal negligence was found, his conduct reflected impaired professional judgment. He resigned quietly. Claire's husband filed for divorce within weeks. The scandal fed on itself, then gradually thinned as newer stories took its place. Madeline tracked none of it directly, but she heard through professional networks. Seattle was smaller than it pretended to be. In Manhattan, she worked 16-hour days, complex corporate disputes, depositions that lasted until midnight. She dismantled opposing counsel with precision that bordered on ruthless. Colleagues began to whisper about her in a different way. Brilliant, controlled, relentless. At night, when the apartment fell silent, she sometimes reached for her phone out of habit, expecting school emails or reminders about dance recitals. Instead, there was only the glow of unanswered notifications. Jonathan sent a final message 3 months after she left. "I am in therapy. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I would trade everything to go back to that morning." Madeline read it once, then archived it. 5 months after arriving in New York, she received confirmation that she would lead a high-stakes shareholder litigation case involving a healthcare conglomerate. The role came with visibility, with risk, with reward. Daniel called her into his office. "This is partner-track territory," he said. "If you win." She nodded. Winning had always mattered to her. But now it felt different. Winning meant control. Control meant safety. She walked back to her office and looked at the Manhattan skyline, framed by glass. 5 years ago, her life had been built around family dinners and carefully scheduled weekends. around balancing court appearances with pediatric appointments. Now it was built around filings and verdicts. She told herself this was strength, that she was rebuilding. What she did not admit, not even to herself, was that success was easier than forgiveness. In Seattle, Jonathan drove past Lily's school, sometimes without meaning to. He still kept one of her drawings in the glove compartment of his car. A purple horse. Claire moved to San Francisco quietly. She stopped attending galas. Her name faded from society pages. Lives adjusted. Reputations thinned. And in Manhattan, Madeline Carter began the long process of becoming untouchable. She did not yet realize that 5 years from now, the law would drag her back across the country, to the hospital, to Jonathan, to Claire, to the place where everything had ended. For now, she worked. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, grief hardened into ambition. By the time Madeline Carter's name appeared in the legal section of the Wall Street Journal, she had perfected the art of composure. The article called her one of Manhattan's most formidable corporate litigators under 45. It mentioned her surgical cross-examinations and her ability to dismantle CEOs without raising her voice. It did not mention Bellevue. It did not mention Lily. Her office occupied the corner of the 48th floor, glass on 2 sides, the East River slicing silver beneath her window. The desk was minimalist, no framed family photos, no visible history. Only stacked case files and a leather-bound planner embossed with her initials. She wore tailored charcoal suits now. Sleek, intentional, armor disguised as elegance. On a Wednesday morning in early October, she stood before a federal judge and argued a motion to dismiss in a healthcare antitrust case. Her tone was steady, deliberate. When opposing counsel attempted to interrupt, she paused just long enough to let the courtroom settle into her silence. By the time she finished, the judge was nodding. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Microphones angled toward her face. "Miss Carter, do you believe this merger will survive regulatory scrutiny?" "I believe the law speaks for itself," she replied. She did not linger. Back at the firm, Daniel Whitaker now addressed her as an equal. "The board is impressed," he told her over coffee in the executive lounge. "Another year like this, and your partnership is guaranteed." Another year. Madeline calculated life in 12-month increments now. Manageable spans. Measurable achievements. That night, she attended a client dinner in Tribeca. A private dining room. Soft lighting. Conversations about healthcare markets and venture capital. She laughed at the right moments. Maintained eye contact. Declined the second glass of wine. Across the table, a biotech executive named Adrian Shaw studied her with open interest. "You're impossible to read," he said lightly. "That's the job," she replied. Later, in the back of a town car heading uptown, she watched the city flicker past. Neon signs, scaffolding, couples huddled beneath umbrellas. Her phone vibrated. A calendar reminder. October 14th. For a moment, she didn't place it. Then she did. Lily would have been 12. Madeline stared at the notification until it disappeared from the screen. In the apartment, silence greeted her like an old companion. The space was curated. Modern art, neutral furniture, a wine fridge she rarely used. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the river and the restless movement of traffic. She removed her heels and walked barefoot across cool marble. 5 years ago, she had left Seattle with 2 suitcases and a grief so sharp it threatened to undo her. Now she owned this apartment. She had a diversified portfolio, a reserved seat at industry conferences, invitations to charity galas in Manhattan where no one whispered about her. She had everything, except a photograph. She had never unpacked the framed picture of Lily from the Bellevue house. It remained wrapped in tissue paper in the back of her closet. Not discarded, not displayed, suspended. Her phone buzzed again. An email this time. Subject, West Sound Medical Systems, urgent representation inquiry. She almost ignored it. Healthcare mergers had become her specialty. Inquiries arrived daily. But something in the sender's name caught her attention. West Sound Medical Systems. Seattle. Her pulse shifted, barely perceptible, but real. She opened the email. The message was formal, outlining a complex hospital merger facing regulatory challenges. They required aggressive litigation strategy, discretion, experience with antitrust scrutiny and healthcare consolidation. She read it twice before noticing the name of the acting chief medical officer, Jonathan Reed. The air in the apartment thinned. She set the phone down carefully on the kitchen counter. 5 years was a lifetime in Manhattan. A blink in memory. Jonathan had resurfaced professionally, not as the celebrated trauma surgeon he once was, but still within the system, still inside the world of hospitals and funding and administrative survival. She walked toward the window, pressing her palm lightly against the glass. Below, the river moved steadily, indifferent to personal history. Her mind began its automatic calculations. Conflict of interest, emotional bias, strategic advantage. She could decline the case, ask Daniel to assign it elsewhere, or she could take it, control the narrative, face the city she had left. Her reflection in the glass looked polished, invulnerable. But beneath the tailored suit and courtroom precision, a quieter question surfaced. Was she strong enough to stand in Seattle again, not as a grieving wife, but as the attorney holding leverage? Her phone vibrated once more. A text from Daniel. Big opportunity. West Sound wants us. Your call. Your call. Madeline closed her eyes briefly. 5 years ago, she had fled Seattle to escape the wreckage. Now the wreckage was requesting her expertise. She picked up the phone and typed a single response. Let's schedule a preliminary review. The message sent with a soft whoosh. In that small sound, the past shifted. She stood alone in her Manhattan apartment, city lights blinking beyond the glass, and understood something she had avoided admitting. Success had insulated her, but it had not absolved her. Seattle was no longer just memory. It was about to become strategy. The air in Seattle felt softer than she remembered. Not warmer, just heavier, like a hand resting lightly at the back of her neck. Madeline stepped out of the rideshare in front of the downtown hotel where West Sound's executive team had arranged a private conference room. The skyline was the same, glass towers rising above Elliott Bay, but she felt like a visitor moving through someone else's photograph. She wore navy this time, structured, controlled. Inside the lobby, muted jazz drifted from hidden speakers. Business travelers wheeled suitcases across polished floors. No one looked at her twice. That anonymity unsettled her. 5 years ago, she had left under the weight of whispers. Now she returned invisible. The conference room overlooked the water. A long mahogany table. Bottled water aligned with corporate precision. Legal binders stacked at each seat. Daniel joined by video from New York, his image crisp on the wall-mounted screen. We'll start with strategy, he said. Then open the floor. The West Sound executives filtered in gradually. CFO, legal counsel, 2 board members. Jonathan entered last. For a moment, the room narrowed again, just as it had in the hospital hallway years ago. He looked older. Not dramatically, but enough. The confident ease he once carried had thinned. His hair was grayer at the temples. His suit fit well, but lacked the quiet arrogance she used to recognize. He met her eyes and did not smile. Ms. Carter, he said evenly. Dr. Reed. The formality hung between them like glass. They took seats opposite each other. Madeline began the presentation without hesitation. Her voice was steady, outlining antitrust risks, regulatory hurdles, potential objections from the state attorney general. She spoke of leverage and timing, of narrative framing and compliance audits. She did not once glance at Jonathan longer than necessary, but she felt him watching her. When she paused for questions, the CFO leaned forward. Public perception will be critical, he said. The hospital can't afford another scandal. Another. The word drifted across the table. Madeline's expression did not change. Public perception is shaped by transparency, she replied. If there are vulnerabilities, we address them proactively. Jonathan finally spoke. And if transparency exposes personal history, he asked. Their eyes met. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then we separate personal history from institutional integrity, she said. This case concerns regulatory compliance, not private matters. A faint muscle in his jaw tightened. After 2 hours, the meeting adjourned. Executives filed out, murmuring about timelines and deliverables. Daniel's image disappeared from the screen with a polite farewell. Madeline gathered her papers with methodical care. Jonathan remained seated. When the door closed behind the last board member, silence settled into the space. "I didn't expect you to take this case," he said. "I didn't expect you to still be here," she answered. He absorbed that. "I'm not what I was," he said quietly. "That was clear from the article I read," she replied. The words were sharp, but not loud. He stood, moving to the window overlooking the bay. "I stayed," he said, "because leaving would have felt like running." Madeline slipped her folder into her leather bag. "I left," she said, "because staying felt like suffocating." He turned back to her. "I've replayed that day 1,000 times," he said. "Every second, every vibration of that phone." She felt the old fracture stir, but she did not let it surface. "This isn't the place," she said. "I know." A pause. "I heard about your cases," he added. "You've built something extraordinary." She met his gaze without softness. "Yes," she said simply. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a verdict. "There's something else," he began. Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "What?" "Claire isn't in San Francisco anymore." The name landed with muted force. "She's back in Seattle," he continued. "Her husband's divorce finalized 2 years ago. She's consulting on philanthropic restructuring for regional hospitals." Madeline felt the faintest shift in her breathing. "Is that relevant to this merger?" she asked. "It might be." There was something in his tone, hesitation edged with warning. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. Jonathan looked toward the closed door, then back at her. "The calls that day," he said slowly. "There were more than the report listed." The room seemed to tilt, just slightly. "What do you mean?" "I told investigators about the last one," he said. "The one I reached to silence." But Claire had been calling for weeks about funding pressure. About a board vote tied to her husband's investment group. There were conversations happening that never made it into the official summary. Madeline's mind shifted into legal mode automatically. "Omitted how?" she asked. "Framed as unrelated," he said. "Personal." And they weren't. He hesitated. "They were connected to hospital financing," he said. "To expansion plans. To the very merger we're discussing now." The implications settled between them. If Claire's pressure had influenced Jonathan's state of mind, or the hospital's urgency, then Lily's death had not been merely a private tragedy entangled with an affair. It had been adjacent to institutional stakes. Madeline felt something unfamiliar surface beneath her composure. Not rage, not grief, something colder. "If there's material information that wasn't disclosed," she said evenly, "I need everything." Jonathan nodded. "I'll send you what I have." She studied him carefully. 5 years ago, she had left this city hollowed by betrayal. Now she stood in a boardroom where personal history and corporate survival were beginning to overlap. This was no longer just about an affair. It was about power. And power, she understood intimately. As she exited the hotel and stepped back into the damp Seattle air, the past no longer felt distant. It felt strategic. Her phone buzzed in her hand. An unknown local number. She answered without hesitation. "Madeline Carter," she said. A woman's voice responded, measured, familiar. "I think it's time we spoke," Claire Donovan said. Madeline did not sleep well in Seattle. The hotel sheets were crisp, the room temperature precisely controlled, the city outside softened by mist, but memory had a way of slipping beneath controlled environments. At 6 a.m., she was already seated at the small glass desk by the window, Jonathan's forwarded documents open across her laptop screen. Email chains. Board summaries. Funding projections tied to West Sound's expansion into rural trauma centers. Claire's name appeared frequently, not in romantic language, but in strategic discussions. Urgent. Time-sensitive. Critical to donor alignment. Madeline scrolled slowly. 3 weeks before the accident, Claire had written, "If Jonathan doesn't publicly support the expansion timeline, the board vote could fracture. We cannot afford hesitation right now." Jonathan's reply had been brief. "I understand." Madeline leaned back in her chair. The affair had been emotional. That much was undeniable. But layered beneath it had been institutional pressure, subtle, persuasive, relentless. Her phone vibrated. A text from Jonathan. "I've sent everything I have access to." Some of the board minutes were redacted during the review. Redacted. She typed back. By whom? A pause. Then, hospital legal. They categorized it as unrelated to the accident. Madeline closed her eyes briefly. Unrelated. In corporate language, that often meant inconvenient. By mid-morning, she was seated in West Sound's temporary legal office downtown, across from the hospital's general counsel, a cautious man named Richard Hale. I'll need unredacted board minutes from Q3, 5 years ago, she said evenly. Richard adjusted his glasses. Those materials were reviewed during the internal investigation, he replied. Nothing actionable was found. I'm not questioning your conclusion, Madeline said. I'm questioning the scope. He studied her carefully. This merger is already under regulatory scrutiny, he said. Reopening historical matters could invite unnecessary attention. There is no such thing as unnecessary attention in litigation, she replied. Only unmanaged risk. He hesitated. You believe there's exposure tied to Dr. Reed's accident? I believe exposure exists when context is incomplete, she said. The distinction was deliberate. Later that afternoon, she met Jonathan in a quiet cafe near the waterfront, neutral ground, public enough to discourage emotional volatility. He arrived early. She noticed the habit hadn't changed. You look, he began, then stopped. Professional, she supplied. He nodded faintly. They ordered coffee, sat across from each other in a space filled with low conversation and the smell of roasted beans. I never told investigators how intense it had become, Jonathan said quietly. The pressure. From Claire. From the board. From donors. She was the conduit. He stared into his cup. They needed visible physician endorsement for the expansion. I was the trauma face of the hospital. She pushed. I agreed to private meetings. It blurred. Madeline watched him carefully. And the day of the accident. She had called 3 times that afternoon, he said, about a vote scheduled for the following week. Her husband's firm was tying investment to my public support. Madeline's legal instincts sharpened. That's material leverage, she said. Yes. Why wasn't that disclosed? Because it complicated the narrative, he replied. An affair was easier to contain than funding coercion. The word coercion lingered. Madeline felt something shift, not forgiveness, not sympathy, but clarity. Lily's death had been filed under personal failure. What if it had also been shaped by institutional urgency? Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. She stepped outside to answer. This is Madeline. I'm at the Fairmont, Claire Donovan's voice said. Calm. Controlled. If you're going to dig, you should at least hear my version. Madeline glanced through the cafe window at Jonathan, who sat rigidly at the table. When? She asked. Now. The Fairmont lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old money. Claire sat near the fireplace, posture impeccable, dressed in understated cream. Time had altered her, too. The social brightness she once carried had dimmed into something more guarded. Madeline approached without hesitation. Thank you for coming, Claire said. I didn't, Madeline replied. You called. Claire accepted that. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, not as rival women, but as survivors of the same implosion. I never intended for any of it to reach that point, Claire began. No one ever does, Madeline said. Claire inhaled slowly. The board was fracturing, she said. My husband's firm had invested heavily. We needed Jonathan's public endorsement to stabilize donor confidence. I pushed him. I blurred boundaries. And yes, I crossed lines I shouldn't have. Madeline remained still. The calls that day, she asked. I was trying to reach him before a preliminary funding meeting, Claire said. I didn't know he was driving. But you knew he was distracted, Madeline said. Claire's composure flickered for the first time. I knew he was overwhelmed, she admitted. Silence settled between them. Did you ever tell investigators about the funding pressure? Madeline asked. No, Claire said softly. Because once the affair surfaced, everything else became irrelevant. Irrelevant. The same word, reframed. Madeline studied her. Do you understand, she said carefully, that if I uncover institutional coercion tied to a fatal accident, this merger will not survive? Claire held her gaze. Do you understand, she replied, that if you don't, you'll be building your case on a lie? The fireplace crackled faintly beside them. Madeline felt the weight of choice settling into her chest. Expose everything and risk reopening Lily's death in public discourse. Or proceed cleanly, efficiently, professionally, and let the deeper truth remain buried. For the first time since returning to Seattle, she felt the past not just as memory, but as leverage. And leverage, she knew, always came at a cost. Claire did not cry. Madeline noticed that first. There were no trembling hands, no theatrics. Just a woman sitting upright in a hotel lobby, spine straight, as if posture alone could keep history contained. I was not just a donor's wife, Claire said evenly. I chaired 3 committees. I negotiated funding structures. I was the one the board sent when conversations needed persuasion. Madeline listened without interrupting. Jonathan was reluctant about the expansion, Claire continued. He believed the trauma wing was understaffed. That pushing growth without infrastructure was dangerous. Madeline felt something shift slightly. He never said that publicly, she said. He couldn't, Claire replied. His reputation was built on confidence. Mine was built on influence. The fireplace cast a low amber glow across the polished lobby floor. So you influenced him, Madeline said. Yes. The honesty was unnerving. At first it was professional, Claire added. Late meetings. Strategy discussions. He respected my analysis. I admired his ethics. And then? Madeline asked. Claire's gaze lowered briefly. And then it became personal. We both felt unseen in our marriages. That's not an excuse. It's context. Context. Madeline hated the word. It threatened the simplicity of betrayal. You knew he had a daughter, she said quietly. I did. And you still called him that afternoon. Claire's composure wavered, not outwardly, but in the faint tightening around her mouth. I called because the board vote was collapsing, she said. My husband had tied additional funding to Jonathan's endorsement. If he withdrew support, we would lose millions in pledged capital. And that justified 3 calls while he was driving? No, Claire said. Nothing justifies that. Silence pressed between them. For 5 years, Madeline said slowly, I have believed that Lily died because her father chose an affair over attention. Claire met her eyes directly. He chose ambition, she said. And so did I. The sentence settled with unexpected force. Madeline felt a flicker of resistance rise in her chest. Don't equate us, she said quietly. I'm not, Claire replied. I'm acknowledging that the culture we moved in rewarded overextension. We glorified urgency. We answered every call. Madeline thought of Manhattan, of midnight emails, of her own refusal to power down. I never drove distracted with my child in the car, she said. No, Claire agreed softly. You didn't. The admission disarmed the edge of accusation. Claire leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said. I'm asking you to understand that the hospital buried the funding pressure to protect itself. The affair became the headline because it was cleaner than institutional negligence. Madeline's mind began assembling possibilities. If the hospital had accelerated expansion despite staffing concerns, if donor leverage had shaped medical leadership decisions, if Jonathan had been publicly pressured to endorse a timeline he privately doubted, then the accident existed within a web larger than infidelity. Why tell me now? Madeline asked. Claire's gaze drifted toward the tall windows overlooking the gray Seattle sky. Because this merger repeats the same pattern, she said. Aggressive growth. Political donors. Physicians stretched thin. And you're consulting again. Yes. On which side? On survival. Madeline studied her carefully. You're still inside the machine, she said. So are you, Claire replied gently. The words landed with quiet precision. Madeline felt the echo of Manhattan boardrooms, investor dinners, the careful alignment of legal strategy with financial appetite. She stood abruptly. This conversation changes nothing about what happened, she said. No, Claire agreed. It doesn't, but it may change what happens next. Claire nodded once. That's why I called. Outside, the city felt smaller than Manhattan, but heavier with memory. Madeline walked toward the waterfront alone, heels clicking against damp pavement. The air carried salt and rain. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan. Did you meet her? She typed back. Yes. And Madeline paused. There are more layers than I knew. A long delay. Then, I never meant for you to carry this alone. She stared at the words. For years, anger had provided structure. A clean line between wrong and right. Now that line blurred. At the edge of the pier, she stopped and looked out at the water. Ferries moved steadily across the bay. The sky pressed low and colorless. If the hospital had suppressed material context, if Claire's calls had been about funding leverage rather than just romance, then the narrative that destroyed her marriage had also protected an institution. And she, unknowingly, had accepted that version because it hurt less than confronting systemic failure. Her phone rang again. Daniel, how's Seattle? He asked. Complicated, she said. We need to decide how aggressive we're going to be with document requests, he continued. If we dig too deep into historical governance, regulators may widen the scope. Madeline watched the water shift beneath the wind. If governance influenced physician conduct that led to public scandal, she said carefully, regulators deserve to know. Daniel was silent for a beat. That could destabilize the merger, he said. Yes. And West Sound is our client. Madeline closed her eyes briefly. Client. Institution. Truth. I'm aware, she said. When she ended the call, the weight of decision pressed harder than any courtroom argument ever had. For 5 years, she had built a life defined by control. Now control required risk. The past was no longer just personal. It was evidentiary. And if she chose to uncover it fully, the consequences would extend far beyond her marriage. They would ripple through boardrooms, donors, reputations. Through Jonathan. Through Claire. Through the city that had quietly absorbed her loss. The question was no longer whether she had everything. It was what she was willing to lose to find out the rest. The unredacted board minutes arrived at 2:17 a.m. Richard Hale had resisted for 2 days, citing privilege, strategic timing, regulatory sensitivity. But Madeline had invoked discovery leverage with quiet insistence. Eventually, compliance prevailed. She was awake when the encrypted file landed in her inbox. Seattle was silent outside her hotel window. A thin rain streaked the glass, blurring the city into muted shapes. She opened the document slowly, as if speed might alter its contents. There it was. 3 weeks before the accident. A board discussion noting physician fatigue concerns within the trauma department. Jonathan's name referenced directly, his hesitation about endorsing accelerated expansion without additional hires. A follow-up entry, donor representatives emphasize urgency. Delay risks capital withdrawal. And beneath that, Dr. Reed advised to align public messaging with strategic timeline. Advised. Madeline stared at the word until its edges lost clarity. Not ordered. Not coerced. Advised. Corporate language again. Gentle. Suggestive. Plausibly deniable. She leaned back in her chair. If she submitted this into regulatory review, it would raise questions about governance pressure and operational safety. It would not prove causation, but it would complicate the hospital's clean narrative. It would also reopen Lily's death in public filings. At 9 a.m., she convened a closed-door meeting with West Sound's executive team. Jonathan sat along the side wall, no longer center stage, but still present. Claire was not there. Her consulting role remained unofficial, peripheral. Richard Hale spoke first. We've disclosed all relevant materials, he said. We believe historical governance issues are immaterial to current merger approval. Madeline folded her hands on the table. Immaterial legally? She asked. Or inconvenient structurally? A faint ripple moved across the board members' expressions. The accident was personal misconduct, Richard replied. Tragic, but separate. Except, Madeline said evenly. The board minutes demonstrate institutional pressure applied to a physician who had raised safety concerns. Silence thickened. Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on the table. One board member, an older woman with silver hair, spoke carefully. We cannot allow a past tragedy to derail future healthcare access for thousands, she said. This merger will stabilize rural trauma services. Madeline felt the weight of that argument settle heavily. Lives beyond Lily. Communities dependent on funding. This is not about derailing, Madeline said. It is about transparency. Regulators will discover these minutes eventually. If we withhold or minimize, exposure multiplies. Richard's voice hardened slightly. You are our counsel, he said. Your role is to guide us through approval, not to reopen settled matters. There it was. The line. Professional loyalty. She glanced briefly at Jonathan. For the first time since her return, he met her eyes without flinching. 5 years ago, she had wanted him to suffer publicly. Now she wanted clarity. I am your counsel, she said, which means I protect the institution from future collapse. Concealment is short-term strategy. Disclosure is long-term survival. A board member shifted in his seat. If regulators link governance pressure to a fatal accident, he said, the reputational damage could be irreversible. Madeline held his gaze. Reputation built on omission is already unstable. The room fell silent. After the meeting adjourned without resolution, she remained seated alone for several minutes. Jonathan approached quietly. You don't have to do this, he said. Do what? She asked. Dig until it hurts everyone. She looked up at him. It already hurt everyone, she said softly. He absorbed that. I carried the blame, he said. I deserved it. Yes, she agreed. The honesty startled them both. But if the board pressured you to publicly endorse something you doubted, she continued, that context matters. He shook his head faintly. It won't bring her back. No, she said. But it might prevent someone else from driving distracted under the weight of institutional expectation. They stood in silence. Later that afternoon, Daniel called from New York. I'm hearing resistance from the board, he said. They're concerned you're widening scope unnecessarily. I'm narrowing risk, she replied. If this blows up, he said, we lose the client. Madeline walked toward the window overlooking Elliott Bay. The water churned under gray light. Then we lose the client, she said. There was a long pause on the other end. This could affect your partnership vote, Daniel added quietly. The words landed with unexpected force. For 5 years, she had built toward that threshold, measured success in billable hours and verdicts, sacrificed softness for leverage, partnership, control, everything. She pressed her fingers lightly against the glass. And if I ignore material governance pressure tied to a fatal accident, she asked, what exactly am I partnering with? Daniel exhaled slowly. I'll back your strategy, he said at last. But understand the stakes. I do, she replied. After the call ended, she remained by the window. For years, she had defined strength as endurance, absorbing pain without collapse. Now strength felt different. It felt like risk. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Claire. They're nervous. You're pushing harder than expected. Madeline typed back. Transparency isn't aggression. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Outside, a fairy horn echoed across the water. Madeline closed her eyes briefly. If she proceeded, the merger would survive only if it restructured governance openly. Donor influence would be scrutinized. Board dynamics exposed. Jonathan's past would resurface in regulatory filings. Not as scandal, but as case study. Lily's name would appear again. Not in gossip columns. In legal documentation. She inhaled slowly. For 5 years, she had chased a version of everything that required emotional containment. Now she faced a choice between professional assent and moral clarity. The irony did not escape her. The same culture of urgency and prestige that had shaped Jonathan's distraction had also shaped her ambition. The question was no longer whether she could win. It was whether winning meant repeating the pattern. As evenings settled over Seattle, Madeline drafted a memorandum to regulators recommending proactive disclosure of historical governance pressures alongside merger filings. Her finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. Then she pressed it. In that small act, she understood something with unsettling precision. Having everything was not the same as having peace. And peace, unlike power, could not be negotiated. The regulators responded faster than expected. Within a week of Madeline's memorandum, the state attorney general's office requested supplemental documentation regarding West Sound's governance practices 5 years prior. Not accusatory. Not yet. But attentive. News did not break publicly. However, tension moved through the hospital corridors like static electricity. Staff sensed scrutiny. Board members scheduled emergency meetings. Donor representatives began asking careful questions. Madeline received the subpoena extension late on a Thursday afternoon. Attached to it was a request for telecommunications records tied to executive communications during the quarter preceding the accident. She stared at the line item. Telecommunications records. Jonathan was in his small administrative office when she called. "They're asking for phone logs," she said. There was a brief silence on the other end. "From that day?" he asked. "From the entire quarter. I already gave them access to my personal records 5 years ago." "Not through institutional subpoena," she replied. "Through internal review." Another silence. He understood the difference. That evening, they met in a private conference room at the hospital, neutral territory once again. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old carpet. The walls were painted in a color meant to calm. Jonathan placed a printed phone log on the table between them. "I requested a copy from my provider this afternoon," he said, "before it becomes public record." Madeline sat opposite him. She did not immediately touch the paper. "Are there surprises?" she asked. "Yes," he said quietly. She picked it up. The calls were time-stamped with indifferent precision. 2:41 p.m. Incoming. Claire Donovan 2:47 p.m. Incoming. Claire Donovan 2:52 p.m. Incoming. Claire Donovan 2:58 p.m. Incoming. Claire Donovan 3:01 p.m. Outgoing. Claire Donovan 11 seconds. 3:04 p.m. Emergency services contacted. Madeline felt her breath slow, not from calm, but from concentration. "The report listed one call," she said. "I disclosed the final one," Jonathan replied. "The one I answered. You didn't disclose the 4 before. They were categorized as non-essential." "By whom?" "Hospital legal." Madeline's eyes moved back to the timestamps. "For missed calls in 17 minutes. What happened at 3:01, she asked. Jonathan swallowed. "I answered," he said. "She was panicking about the vote. I told her I couldn't talk. I ended the call. And then I put the phone down on the center console. It lit up again." His voice thinned slightly. "I reached to silence it." Madeline's chest tightened despite herself. "Were you speeding?" "No." "Texting?" "No." "Just reaching?" "Yes." Silence expanded in the small room. For 5 years, she had imagined that moment in abstract terms: distraction, vibration, a glance away. Now it narrowed to something physical. A hand leaving the steering wheel. A phone lighting up. A child in the back seat. "I have replayed it every night," Jonathan said quietly. "If I had ignored it. If I had turned the phone off. If I had pulled over." Madeline studied him. "You could have," she said. "Yes." The admission was clean, unvarnished. There was no institutional language in it. No euphemism. Just choice. A knock at the door interrupted them. Claire entered without ceremony. She had been called in by hospital counsel after learning about the telecommunications request. Her gaze moved from Jonathan to Madeline to the phone log still on the table. "They found the missed calls," she said softly. Madeline held her eyes. "They're not missed," she replied. "They're documented." Claire stepped closer, reading the timestamps. "I didn't know he was driving," she said. "You knew he was overwhelmed," Madeline answered. Claire's jaw tightened. "I thought urgency justified persistence," she said. "I was wrong." Jonathan looked between them. "It was my hand on the wheel," he said. "Not yours." Madeline felt something fracture again, but differently this time. The first collapse had been her family. This was the collapse of narrative. For years, the affair had been the explanation. Then governance pressure complicated it. Now the phone log reduced everything to a moment of divided attention. Systemic culture had shaped urgency, but it had not moved his hand. The room felt smaller. "If regulators see this," Claire said carefully, "they will connect funding pressure to repeated calls." "They should," Madeline replied. "And what does that accomplish?" Claire asked. Madeline turned toward her fully. "It accomplishes accuracy," she said, "which is not the same as revenge." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "I am willing to submit an addendum," he said. "A full account." Madeline looked at him for a long moment. 5 years ago, she had wanted him to be punished. Now she wanted him to be precise. "You understand what this means?" she said. Your name will reappear. Not as rumor, as record. I understand, he said. Claire's voice lowered. And mine. Madeline did not hesitate. Yes. The word hung heavily. Outside the conference room, hospital life continued. Gurneys rolled down hallways. Monitors beeped steadily. Nurses moved between rooms unaware that a past tragedy was being recalibrated in quiet tones. Madeline gathered the documents. For the first time, she said quietly, we are not protecting ourselves. We are protecting truth. Jonathan nodded faintly. Claire closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing impact. As Madeline stepped into the corridor, she felt neither vindicated nor relieved. Just sober. The second collapse was quieter than the first. No flashing lights. No emergency rooms. Just acknowledgement. In the elevator, alone, she leaned her head back against the cool metal wall. For 5 years, she had built a life on certainty. He betrayed us, and we paid the price. Now the truth was heavier. He betrayed us. The institution pressured him. You both answered the call. The layers did not cancel each other. They accumulated. When the elevator doors opened to the lobby, the late afternoon sun filtered through high windows, pale and indifferent. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. Regulators are escalating review, he said. The board is furious. Of course they are, she replied. This could jeopardize approval. Yes. And your partnership vote is next month. Madeline stepped outside into the Seattle air. Then the vote will reflect who I am, she said. There was no tremor in her voice. After ending the call, she stood on the hospital steps for a long moment. 5 years ago, she had lost her family in a single day. Now she had influence, reputation, wealth, everything. And yet standing there, watching the city move around her, she understood something with painful clarity. Closure was not about assigning blame perfectly. It was about accepting that tragedy can be both personal and systemic, and that accountability does not erase grief. It only sharpens it. The board meeting began at 7:30 a.m. sharp. Madeline arrived before anyone else. The conference room overlooked Elliott Bay, pale lights spilling across polished wood. A carafe of coffee sat untouched at the center of the table. Outside, ferries cut steady lines through gray water, indifferent to human consequence. By the time the directors entered, tension had replaced courtesy. Richard Hale spoke first. Regulators have expanded review to include governance practices during the expansion cycle 5 years ago, he said. This is directly tied to your memorandum. He did not need to say her name. Madeline folded her hands calmly. Yes. One board member leaned forward, voice tight. You have exposed us to unnecessary scrutiny. No, she replied evenly. You exposed yourselves when you minimized material pressure. The word pressure lingered. Jonathan sat at the far end of the table, not as a voting member, but as a participant in the record. Claire was absent, though her shadow seemed present in every sentence. We retained you to secure approval, another director said, not to reopen historical wounds. Madeline held his gaze. You retain me to protect the institution, she said. Approval without integrity is temporary. Silence. The room felt like a courtroom, though no judge presided. Richard slid a document toward her. We have drafted a revised disclosure statement, he said. It acknowledges governance intensity during the prior expansion cycle without assigning fault to specific individuals. Madeline scanned the page. Careful phrasing. Shared responsibility. Structural lessons learned. Commitment to physician workload safeguards moving forward. Jonathan's name did not appear. Claire's did not either. Instead, leadership communication gaps contributed to operational strain. Gaps. A softer word than truth. This protects the merger, Richard said, and the hospital's long-term stability. Madeline looked up. And what protects accuracy? She asked. Jonathan spoke quietly from the end of the table. I will submit a personal addendum, he said, clarifying my own decision-making that day. Every head turned. That is not necessary, Richard said sharply. It is, Jonathan replied. Madeline watched him carefully. This was not self-flagellation, not drama. It was deliberate. If we speak only in abstractions, Jonathan continued, we repeat the pattern. I made a choice to answer and silence a phone while driving. That belongs in the record. Claire's absence felt heavier. One director exhaled sharply. This will reignite media attention, he said. Yes, Madeline said. And cost us. Yes. The room stilled. For 5 years, she continued, this institution benefited from a simplified narrative. An affair. A distracted driver. A tragic accident. She let the words settle. But governance pressure existed. Funding urgency existed. Physician fatigue existed. If we are asking regulators to trust this merger, we cannot offer them curated memory. Richard leaned back, frustration visible. And what of proportionality, he asked. Should one family's tragedy destabilize access for thousands? The question was pointed. Madeline felt its weight fully. For a moment, she saw Lily at 7, purple horse in hand, sunlight in her hair. Then she saw rural emergency rooms dependent on West Sound's funding. Lives did not compete cleanly. That tragedy already destabilized us, she said quietly. This is about ensuring it is not repeated. Jonathan's gaze remained steady. I support full disclosure, he said. A murmur rippled through the board. Madeline felt something shift inside her. Not triumph, not vindication. Alignment. 5 years ago, she had wanted him to suffer alone. Now she saw something different. A man willing to carry his part without hiding behind institutional language. Richard looked at her sharply. If we proceed as you recommend, he said, there is no guarantee the merger survives. Madeline nodded. I understand. And if it fails? Then it fails honestly. The room fell into uneasy quiet. Finally, the silver-haired director who had spoken earlier broke the silence. What if we restructure governance as part of the filing? She asked slowly. Independent oversight on physician workload. Donor firewall provisions. Transparency protocols. Madeline turned toward her. That would demonstrate corrective action, she said. Without dismantling the entire deal, the director added. Richard hesitated. It would still require acknowledging past pressure, he said. Yes, Madeline replied. Another pause. Then, gradually, reluctant agreement. Not enthusiastic. Not grateful. But pragmatic. The board voted to adopt revised disclosures, including governance reform commitments and Jonathan's voluntary addendum. The merger would proceed, with scrutiny. After the meeting adjourned, the room emptied slowly. Jonathan remained seated. You could have destroyed me, he said quietly. I know, Madeline replied. And you didn't. She considered that. I didn't protect you, she said. I protected the record. He nodded faintly. That's more than I deserved. She did not answer. Outside, the sky had lightened slightly. A fragile brightness over the water. Her phone vibrated. Daniel. The board agreed to your structure, he said. Reform language included. It's risky, but regulators seem receptive. And my partnership? She asked calmly. A brief pause. Some partners think you jeopardized revenue, he admitted. Others think you demonstrated leadership. Madeline watched a ferry pull away from the dock. And you? She asked. I think, Daniel said slowly, that you decided what kind of lawyer you want to be. After the call ended, she remained by the window alone. 5 years ago, she had left Seattle believing everything had been taken from her. Now she stood in the same city, having chosen not vengeance, but accountability. The merger might still collapse. Media might resurface. Her career trajectory might shift. But for the first time in years, she did not feel hollow. She felt deliberate. Having everything, she realized, was less about accumulation, more about alignment. And alignment required sacrifice. As she stepped out of the building into the cool Seattle air, she understood that one final act remained. Not legal, not strategic. Personal. The cemetery sat on a gentle slope overlooking Lake Washington. Madeline had not returned since the funeral. For 5 years, she had avoided this particular geography, this measured quiet, these rows of names carved into stone. She told herself she honored Lily privately. In motion, in success, in survival. But avoidance was not reverence. It was postponement. The morning was overcast. The sky stretched thin and colorless. Early autumn leaves gathered along the path as she walked toward the small headstone she knew by memory alone. Lily and Carter, beloved daughter, 2012 to 2019, 7 years. Madeline knelt slowly, placing her hand against the cool granite. There was no dramatic collapse, no sobbing that echoed across the grass. Just breath. Behind her, footsteps approached softly. She did not need to turn to know who it was. Jonathan stopped a respectful distance away. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure either," she replied. He did not step closer. For a moment, they stood in parallel silence. Two people who had once shared everything, now united only by absence. The regulators accepted the revised filing. Jonathan said after a while, "Conditional approval. Oversight committee included." She nodded. "I read the update. And your firm? Partnership vote is next week." He hesitated. "You'll get it." She studied the inscription on the stone. "That's not the point anymore," she said. The word surprised them both. 5 years ago, ambition had become her scaffolding. Each victory another brick between her and collapse. Now the structure felt sufficient, but not defining. Jonathan stepped closer, stopping just short of the grave. "I wrote my addendum," he said. "It's public record now." She had read it the night before. It was brief. He acknowledged answering the call, reaching for the phone, allowing urgency, personal and professional, to override attention. No defensiveness, no dilution, just ownership. "I know," she said. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added. "I know." The wind moved gently through the trees. For a long time, Madeline had believed forgiveness meant reconciliation, or weakness, or erasing harm. Now she understood it differently. It was not about restoring what had been broken. It was about no longer carrying the fracture as identity. "I blamed you cleanly," she said at last. "It was easier that way." He absorbed that without protest. "You deserved blame," she continued, "but not exclusively." He looked at her, confusion flickering briefly. "The culture deserved blame," she said. "The board, the donors, the urgency we all participated in." "And you?" he asked quietly. She did not look away. "I was building my own momentum," she said. "Late nights, endless calls, measuring worth by output." He shook his head faintly. "You weren't driving." "No," she agreed. "But I understood the addiction to importance." The honesty settled between them. "I loved you," he said softly. "I know. And I loved her. I know." There was no dramatic embrace, no collapse into shared grief, only acknowledgement. After a while, Jonathan stepped back. "I'll leave you," he said. She nodded. When he walked away, she remained kneeling beside the stone. For the first time in years, she allowed memory to unfold without strategy attached to it. Lily's laughter at the breakfast table. Purple crayon pressed too hard against paper. Small fingers sticky with melted ice cream. Not the hospital. Not the phone. Just her. Madeline closed her eyes and let herself cry. Not violently, not theatrically. Just enough to release pressure. 5 years ago, she had lost her family in a single day. In the aftermath, she had rebuilt with precision. Wealth accumulated. Influence expanded. Her name carried weight in rooms that once would have intimidated her. On paper, she had everything. But kneeling there, she understood the flaw in that metric. Everything did not mean restoration. It meant choice. She had chosen truth over revenue, transparency over protection, accountability over revenge. And now, here, she chose to remember Lily not as a catalyst for ambition, but as a child whose life had been small and luminous and real. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. A message from Daniel. "Vote confirmed. Congratulations, partner." She stared at the screen. 5 years ago, that message would have felt like vindication. Now it felt steady. She typed back a simple acknowledgement and slipped the phone away. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of water. Madeline rose slowly, brushing damp grass from her knees. "I have everything," she whispered softly, not as declaration, but as understanding. Not because nothing had been lost, but because she no longer needed loss to define her. As she walked back toward the path, the sky began to thin, a faint brightness pressing through gray. Seattle no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like origin. And origin, she realized, did not have to be prison. It could be place.